Well, it's good to be together. We're in a series that we are calling Counterfeit, and today we're talking about counterfeit women. Back in 2002, a movie came out called Catch Me If You Can. It stars Leonardo DiCaprio. He is playing Frank Abagnale Jr. Tom Hanks is the other lead in the movie, and he is playing the character Carl Hanratty. It's a little different than a lot of movies. It's a true story. And in the movie, Leonardo DiCaprio, Frank Abagnale Jr., he is a serial counterfeiter. He's also going to pass himself off as a doctor and a lawyer and a pilot. And he's very good at what he does. And so Carl, who is with the FBI, sets out trying to catch him, and eventually he will. But he's also going to spend some time trying to get Frank out of the prison system, because really what he wants to do is to have him come alongside him in the FBI, because he's so good at what he does, to help them catch other counterfeiters and criminals. Well, Frank is torn. He doesn't really know what to do, but he's out. He's free, I guess, for lack of a better way of describing it. But Carl's checking up on him. And so they find themselves in an airport. This is pretty late in the movie. And they just start having this conversation. And so he catches up with him at the Dulles airport. And he says, "How do you do it, Frank? How did you pass the bar in Louisiana?" Well, Frank just says, "Well, what are you doing here?" And Carl's, I'm just listening. And then Frank says, I'm sorry that I put you through all of this." Carl says, "If you go back to Europe, you're going to die in a prison. If you try to run here in the States, we're going to send you back to Atlanta for 50 years. Frank says, "I know." "Carl, I spent 4 years trying to arrange your release. I had to convince my boss at the FBI. I had to convince the Attorney General of the United States that you wouldn't run. Why did you do it?" Frank asks. "You're just a kid," he says. "Frank, I'm not your kid. In fact, you said you were going to Chicago." Carl says, my daughter can't see me this weekend. She's going skiing. You said that she was 4 years old. You're lying. She was 4 when I left. She's 15. My wife's been remarried for 11 years, and I see Grace every now and again." "I don't understand," Frank says. Carl says, "Sure you do. Sometimes it's easier living the lie." I think it made sense in Frank's world that he's been living a lie, pretending to be a lawyer, pretending to be a doctor, pretending to be a pilot. It made sense to him that his life was a lie, but he didn't pick up on the parts of Carl's life that were a lie. But I don't think that's just true for the characters in our movie, though it's a true story. I think for a lot of us, we can relate to that we feel like there are parts of our lives that are, as we live them out, we are just kind of living a lie. We act a certain way around people because we just, that's what you're supposed to do. Not really what you want to do, not what you want to act, not where you want to be, but this is what you do. It's just the pretensions, if you will, that we put on in this thing called life. I think it's true in many ways for all of us. And if you will, we are living counterfeit. And our goal, if you will, is to live real lives. And that's not true, or what it is true for is for our women. That's who I'm trying to address, I want to address in our sermon time together today, about not living counterfeit, but living as God would really call a woman to live. And that can be hard because in our world there's been a lot of confusion about what that is. If we go back into the Bible, into the Old Testament, and we just would read our way through, making particular note of women, you will find them in almost every conceivable drama that you can imagine. But one of the dominant features of it is that what made their life successful was that they were married and that they had a child, in particular that they had a married child. Now, going through the Old Testament, you will find them in a lot of situations that are not like that at all, but that's kind of the dominant way that they viewed life and how they were blessed and cared for. Well, fast forward to our day, and it feels like the pendulum has just swung completely the other way. Where there was a sense of dependence, now there is this complete independence. You don't really need a man. You can have a child, you can raise a child, you can provide for yourself, you can do everything, and there really is no need for a man. And so, if you will, we kind of see these two extremes, and then we appreciate that for, I would say, the vast majority of people who are listening, you would say, oh no, I'm just somewhere in the middle, and that's probably how it should be, I guess. But that's what life is like for a lot of people. But how do you know what it means to really be a woman? I had never even heard of this, but Martha Stewart was the headline to the article. It said, Martha Stewart, the original influencer, says that she hates the trad wife trend that's pervading social media. Now, I didn't even know that was happening, but apparently it's a real thing. And so if you would grab your phone or your computer and get on there and type in trad wife, and trad is short for traditional, she doesn't like this trend of these women who are just going back to being traditional wives. They now stay at home. Their kids are in the kitchen with them, helping doing things. On the countertop is a dozen eggs that she went out in the morning that gathered. This is probably too far, but she, milked the cow to provide for the family. She's wearing a dress and she's got an apron on and she's making noodles and the bread is in the oven and just, kind of like like a throwback, if you will, to a different time. But it's becoming, to some degree, it's probably like every other fad. It'll run for a little while and go away. But it's this traditional thing. But apparently Martha Stewart just isn't in favor of that at all. But there are probably some people out there like, yeah, I would like that lifestyle. And then there will be people who, like Martha Stewart and others, who will chastise you for embracing that. They want you to live some other form or some other lifestyle. And at this point, you can talk about a lot of different things. If you are single, there will people who will get after you because you're single and like, what's wrong with you? If you get married, people will get after you because you sold out. You felt like you needed somebody in your life, and you don't need that. You can do it all on your own. And so we have those arguments. If you don't have kids, people get after you. If you have kids, get after you. If you go to raise your kids, they get after you. If you're gender neutral, gender fluid, helicopter mom, and all the other phrases that I'm familiar with and 1,000 I'm not. You just get all these different ways in which, you're told this is what a real woman looks like. And if you aren't measuring up, somebody's going to get mad at you. And to be honest with you, no matter which one you choose, somebody gets after you. Especially if you choose to put yourself out there on social media and make people aware of what you are trying to do. Well, into all of this turbulent water about, what it means to be a woman and what it looks like, it feels like there's just a tremendous amount of lack of clarity. And into that, I think God in His Word, I believe God in His Word says, I can help you with this. What it really means to be a woman. God should know because God made woman. The book of Genesis tells us that God had made man, and man named all the animals, but He recognized quickly, there's nobody here for me. There's no partner for me. So God causes Adam to sleep, and He takes a rib from him, and He forms woman. And they come together, and they are meant to be there for each other, to help each other, to bring it together and make it work. And that word for helper that's used there in the original language, the vast majority of the time in the Bible when it's used, it's actually referencing God. That idea of God coming alongside to fill in the gaps, to complement, to make, and to complete something. And we appreciate that what the role that is meant to be. But if you will, there's more to it than that. And from my perspective, I want to go to the book of Hebrews chapter 11, which is commonly referred to as the faith chapter. Because in this faith chapter, there's a lot of men, but there are some women there. And I think as we look at their lives, it can help us to appreciate, as God says, this is what it means to be a real woman. The first one that we encounter in Hebrews chapter 11 is a woman named Sarah. It says, because Sarah had faith, she was able to have a child long after she had passed the age to have children. She had faith to believe that God would do what he had promised. That was the kind of woman that Sarah was. She had this amazing faith in God. And even though it didn't work according to her timing, her faith still persisted. And I think that's a valuable trait that God says belongs to women who are not counterfeit, but women who are real. For Sarah, she's about 65, when God steps into her in Abraham's world and promises that they are going to have children as numerous as the stars of the sky. Well, as time rolls on, she keeps waiting for God to fulfill this promise, but she never conceives. And so in her frustration, I believe, she gives her servant to Abraham. He sleeps with her, a child is conceived, and it just creates problems in the environment. And that can happen to any of us when we become frustrated and weary in our waiting. But the Bible still says that Sarah just kept by faith waiting and trusting in the Lord. And eventually that day will happen when she will conceive. And when she's about 90 years old, or 90 or 91, she is going to give birth to this child. Faith that trusts God's plan. And I think that's where God wants, and again, I know I'm talking to women predominantly, but reality is that's where God wants all of us to be. To recognize the plan that God has for us, the skills, the talents, and abilities that he's given to us. And yet he says, you won't always understand my way. You aren't always going to understand my timing. But can you have a faith that is just going to wait and to trust in me to do what I have promised you that I am going to do? And you don't have to live a lot of life to appreciate that that can be very challenging. When you wait upon God to work and he doesn't work in your way, your plan, your timing, I thought by now, and Lord's like, no, we've got some more time to go. Do we have faith that can trust in him? But Sarah's not the only woman that we meet here. A little later in the chapter, it says, because the Jews had faith, the walls of Jericho fell down, and after the Jews had walked around the city for 7 days, because Rahab had faith, she was kept from being killed along with those who did not obey God. She was a woman who sold the use of her body, but she helped the men who had come in secret to look over the country. Can we have faith when God steps into our plan? And I think that's what sticks out about Rahab. She's living in a city, and for 40 years, the Israelites have been wandering in the wilderness on the other side of the river, on the other side, outside of the promised land, if you will. And I don't think that was news like our day where something happens over here and 2 minutes later you know about it. But over the course of time, it spread what God was doing through the Israelite people on the other side. The tremendous victories they were having, how they were growing in the power, but as much as anything, what their God was doing for them. And that was different than what the other gods were doing. I mean, he was moving and working in powerful ways, and the other gods, not so much. And so when the time comes that the Israelites come over into the promised land, the power of God, apparently, at least to some, was fairly well known. At least it was known to Rahab. And so when the spies are looking over the land and plotting how they're going to do this, when they make their way to Jericho, Rahab takes them into her home, she hides them, she lies about it, and she sends them on her way. The reality is, some things have been going on in her life and her world, and all of a sudden, God's plan is going to change that. The Bible tells us that she had been selling her body. She was a prostitute, is what she was. And it provided, she had a house, family, those kind of things, but this is what she did to provide and make means. And I think for most of us who are listening, we're like, that's not Not a great thing for somebody to be doing, if you will. But that's where she is. And all of a sudden, God steps into her world through these spies. And now she has to make a decision. What am I going to accept? What am I going to trust? And she sides with the Lord. And I think for a lot of people, we can find ourselves in a similar predicament. We have spent a whole bunch of our life doing what we wanted to do. If you will, prostituting ourselves to other gods and to other things. We've all done that. The Bible is clear. All of us have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Okay, yes, so you weren't a prostitute or whatever it was. I get that. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say that we all have lived lives to satisfy our own flesh, our own desires, our own wishes. And then all of a sudden, God steps into our world and he asks us, I need you to make a decision. Are you going to follow yourself or are you going to follow me? And when Rahab's faith says, I am now going to follow you, she is set apart as a woman who is now stopped being counterfeit and is being real. She is going to do what God has called her to do. When God steps into our plan, will he find in us a kind of faith? And we all deal with that. We all wrestle with that. It's not unique to women. But when we do that, we stop being counterfeit by pursuing in our own dreams, our own goals, our own aspirations, and we do what God has called us to do. And for Rahab, it is credited to her as faith. But she's not the only woman that we encounter. We've met Sarah, and we've met Rahab. Then in verse 35, and it says, it was because some women had faith, they received their dead back to life. A couple places in the Old Testament we can look to that validate this. 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 8 through 37 is one story. 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 8 through 23, it'd be another. But these people, these women had this tremendous faith that they believed in God, that he could do amazingly powerful things. And it's credited to them. And then it's recognized later in the New Testament as this test of faith for them. But it goes on, and it says others chose to be beaten instead of being set free because they could not turn against God. In this way, they would be raised to a better life. Others were talked against. Some were beaten. Some were put in chains and in prison. They were killed by stones being thrown at them. People were cut in pieces. They were tested. They were killed with swords. They wore sheepskin and goats and had nothing that they could call their own. They were hungry. They were sick. Everyone was bad to them. They walked around in the desert and in the mountains. They looked for caves and holes in the earth to live in. They were too good for this world. It was because of their faith that God was pleased with them. But they did not receive what God had promised. God had planned something better for us. These men could not be made perfect without us. What the writer is talking about at the end there is, from our perspective, for those people, their faith was looking forward to something. Our faith looks back, but it's both the cross. But it says these other people, it could be talking about men, but just as easily there could have been a number of women who were included in this group. And if you will, there are times when faith cost us everything. And that's where these people were. Because of their faith in God, they have been chased out of their homes, out of their lives. They're destitute. Some have been stoned to death. All these things have happened. And yet when their faith was put to the test, when their faith would cost them everything, they would not turn against God. But they would choose to stand with him and to follow him, even if it cost them this earthly life, because they looked forward to the cross and the glorious hope of a life that could never be taken from them, though this life could be. And the Lord tells us that is what he wants to see in all of us. That's when we begin to get to this point where we say, my faith isn't counterfeit anymore. My faith is real. That even when it gets hard, even when it asks everything of me, we will go with the Lord. And reality is, this kind of talk shouldn't surprise us. Jesus will tell us about it, all of us. In the book of Luke, chapter 9, there's one verse, verse 18, that says, while Jesus was praying alone, his followers were with him. I just mentioned that verse because it helps us to appreciate the context. Jesus was with, if you will, all of his followers, not just the disciples. And we appreciate in the Bible a lot of those people who followed him were women. They have left things and they now are walking with Jesus. And yet to all of this group, just a couple verses later, Jesus will say this. Then Jesus said to them all, if anyone wants to follow me, he must deny himself and his own desires. He must take up his cross every day and follow me. If anyone wants to keep his own life safe, he must lose it. And if anyone gives up his life because of me, he will save it. Just as we talked about to men last week, we're talking about women this week. What does it mean to be real? What does it mean to not be counterfeit? It is to recognize that sometimes in our life, when we choose to live by faith, it's a little bit like Sarah. That I know what God's promised in his word, and I'm going to, by faith, I'm going to trust and wait for him to deliver on his promise. Will it be frustrating? Sure. Sure it is. But by faith we wait. Sometimes by faith, like Rahab, when God steps into our world and we realize that our plan and his plan are two very different things, we say no to this counterfeit life and we say yes to the Lord. That I'm going to come and follow you. It saved Rahab and her family. And in fact, her genealogy is included in the genealogy of Jesus, who would come into the world to save us and to do for us the same thing he did from Rahab, to save us from ourselves, that we might follow him. And then there are those people of faith who give up everything, willing to lose it all, because they trust in what God has promised gloriously in his word. And so the men of last week and the women of this week, we find ourselves in the same place. What is it to be real? It is to say yes to the Lord. It is to say, yes, Lord. Now, what is the question? I know it's not always going to be easy, but a real Christian simply chooses to follow him in all ways. That is what it means to be a real man. That's what it means to be a real woman. No counterfeit.